March 1973, Los Angeles, California. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, the 45th Academy Awards. The lobby outside the main hall, 40 minutes before the ceremony. A man named Richard Kellner is walking fast through the crowd with a drink in his hand and 3 people trying to keep up with him. He is 54 years old. He has produced 11 pictures. He has been nominated for 2 Oscars and won neither. He has more money than he knows what to do with, and a mouth that has never learned the difference between what it is allowed to say and what it is not. Across the lobby, a man in a plain black tuxedo is standing alone near the far wall with a drink he has barely touched. He is 42 years old. He has just finished directing a picture that no one at the studio believed in, and that is going to make them a great deal of money.
He is not yet a director that the industry takes entirely seriously, because the industry does not take anyone entirely seriously until it has no choice. He is watching the room the way a man watches a room when he is more comfortable watching than being watched. His name is Clint Eastwood. In 90 seconds, Richard Kellner is going to put his hand on Eastwood's arm. Here is the story.
Richard Kellner had come up in the business the way certain men come up in certain businesses, which is to say that he had identified very early the difference between the men who made things and the men who controlled the money those things required. And he had positioned himself on the money side of that line and never moved. He was not without talent. He had an eye for a commercial picture. He knew what sold, and he knew how to greenlight it, and he knew how to get out of the way of the people who made it once the green light was on. What he did not know, and had never learned, was that the people who made things did not forget the way they were treated while the making was happening. Producers who interfere too much are remembered. Producers who dismiss the work are remembered. Producers who stand in hallways at industry parties and hold court about what is and is not worth making, about which directors are and are not worth watching, and who say these things loudly enough that the directors in question can hear them from across the room. These men are remembered most of all. Kellner had made most of these mistakes. He had made several of them specifically in relation to Clint Eastwood. In 1971, Eastwood had been trying to develop a picture about a country musician. It was not an action picture. It was not a Western. It was the kind of quiet, character-driven story that studios tolerate when a name is attached and resist when the name is not sufficiently large. Eastwood's name was large enough by 1971 for a studio to listen, but not so large that the listening was automatic. He had taken the project to 3 studios. At the 3rd meeting, Kellner had been in the room. He was there in an advisory capacity, which in practice meant he was there to say things that the studio head did not want to say directly. Kellner had looked at the project for 10 minutes. He had looked at Eastwood for 2 more. Then he had said, in a room with 9 other people present, that in his opinion, Clint Eastwood's value to the industry was precisely and only his value as an action property, and that anyone who believed a Sergio Leone cowboy was going to make a credible music picture should perhaps look more carefully at the word credible. He said this without lowering his voice. He said this without looking away. He said this the way a man says a thing when he is certain of his position and has not yet learned that certainty of position is not the same as being right. Eastwood had looked at him across the conference table for a moment. He had not responded. He had thanked the studio head for his time. He had picked up his folder and walked out. The music picture eventually got made, and it made money, though not at that studio. Kellner had mentioned the episode at 2 subsequent industry dinners
presenting his involvement as a piece of shrewd commercial judgment. He had mentioned Eastwood by name both times. Eastwood had heard about this. The industry is not large enough for these things not to travel. That was 1971. By March of 1973, Dirty Harry had happened. Play Misty for Me had happened. High Plains Drifter had happened. The studio that had passed on the music picture had watched the numbers on all three and revised its understanding of what Clint Eastwood's value to the industry actually was. Kellner had also watched the numbers. Kellner had a way of revising his understanding of people's value at precisely the rate their numbers improved, which is a quality that certain men in the money business mistake for flexibility, and that everyone else recognizes as something else entirely. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story reaches. The lobby of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion on the evening of March 27, 1973, was the kind of room that exists in very few places in the world. A room where the density of fame and money and mutual assessment reaches a particular pressure that is entirely its own. Everyone in the room was being watched by everyone else. Everyone in the room was watching. It was a room of professionals who spent their working lives performing for cameras and who were now performing for each other, which is harder because the audience knows all the tricks. Eastwood was not performing. He was standing near the far wall with a glass he had not finished and watching the room with the particular quality of attention he had. The stillness that Leone had noticed in 1964 and that had made him say, "Your eyes, just the eyes, just still," and that Eastwood had carried in front of every camera since. He was watching. He was not concerned about being watched in return. He was not working the room. He was not collecting conversations. He was doing what he almost always did in rooms like this, which was wait for them to be over. Kellner saw him from across the lobby. Kellner had been holding court with three people near the bar, a younger producer, a studio executive, and a woman who had written a script Kellner was considering. He had been talking about the directing talent currently working in Hollywood, which was one of Kellner's preferred subjects because he had opinions about it and did not keep them to himself. He had been saying that the Western talent that had driven the box office in the late 60s and early 70s was a transitional phenomenon, that the audience was moving towards something more sophisticated, that a certain generation of directors who had come up through the action picture were going to find themselves running out of road in the next 5 years. He had not said Eastwood's name yet, but the three people with him had understood from his tone and his eye line that Eastwood was somewhere in his thinking. Then Kellner looked across the lobby and saw Eastwood standing alone near the far wall, and the thought arrived in Kellner's mind that he should go over and say hello, because the numbers on Dirty Harry and High Plains Drifter had revised his understanding of Eastwood's value, and because Kellner was the kind of man who followed his revised understandings wherever they led him, without registering the distance between where he had been and where he now intended to go. He crossed the lobby. He had his drink in his left hand. He was moving faster than the crowd wanted him to move, which meant he was bumping shoulders and not apologizing, because he did not notice and would not have apologized anyway. He reached Eastwood. He stopped 2 feet away. He said, "Clint." Eastwood turned. He looked at Kellner. He did not say anything. He waited. Kellner said, "Richard Kellner, we met in 71 at the Columbia meeting. You were bringing in that music project." Eastwood said, "I remember." Kellner said, Great night. Big room out there. He gestured with his glass toward the main hall. He said, "Listen, I've been meaning to say, High Plains Drifter, hell of a picture. Hell of a picture, Clint. Real vision in that thing. I said to Freddie Fielding just last week, I said, Eastwood is building something, I said. He is building a real body of directorial work here that people are going to look at 10 years from now and understand. I said that."
Eastwood looked at him. He said, "You said that." Kellner said, "Absolutely. Absolutely, I said that. Clint, I want to talk to you about something. I've got a project, and I think your sensibility is exactly right for it. I think it is the kind of picture that you are positioned perfectly to make right now, and I'd love to get a meeting on the calendar. What does your schedule look like after the holidays?" Eastwood did not answer immediately. He took a small sip from his glass. He looked at Kellner. He looked at Kellner with the same expression he used when a director asked him to do something a second time that he had already done correctly the first time, which was not an angry expression and was not a cold expression and was simply an expression of a man who has understood the situation completely and is deciding what to do about it. He said, "Richard, I recall that in '71 you told 9 people in a Columbia conference room that my value to the industry was precisely and only as an action property." Kellner's expression shifted. He said, "Clint, that was a different context. That was a development conversation. That's a different kind of—" Eastwood said, "And I recall that you said it at 2 industry dinners after that. I heard about both." Kellner said, "Now look, Clint, that's—" He stepped forward. He reached out with his right hand and put it on Eastwood's forearm. He gripped the forearm. It was the move of a man who uses physical contact to close conversations he is losing, who puts his hand on a shoulder or an arm as a way of saying that whatever has been said before is now concluded, and we are moving to the next thing on my terms. He said, "Clint, come on now. That is water under the bridge. Let's not be—" Eastwood looked down at the hand on his forearm. He looked up at Kellner. The lobby of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was full of conversation and movement, and the noise of 400 people in formal dress assessing one another. And then, in the 6 feet of space around these 2 men, it was not. The 2 people nearest them had gone quiet. Then the people nearest those people had gone quiet, the way silence moves through a room when something is happening at the center of it that tells the room to stop making noise. It was not a loud silence. It was the quiet of people who have understood that they are watching something and have had the instinct, correctly, to stop talking so they can watch it. Eastwood did not raise his voice. He did not move his body. He looked at Kellner's hand on his forearm. He said, "One time." Kellner said, "I'm just saying." Eastwood said, "Take your hand off my arm, Richard." His voice was the same volume it had been for the whole conversation. It was not louder. It was not softer. It was the same. That was the thing about it. A louder voice can be argued with. A softer voice can be ignored. The voice that stays exactly the same while making a statement that the other person understands to be final, that voice is something else. That voice is the voice of a man who has already decided and is simply informing you of his decision. Kellner looked at him. 1 second, 2, 3. The 2 people nearest them were not moving. 4, 5. The people nearest those people were not moving. 6, 7. Kellner's hand came off Eastwood's forearm. 8. The lobby noise came back slowly,
The way sound comes back into a room after a door has been closed in it.
Kellner said, "All right, look, I didn't mean." Eastwood said, "I know what you meant." He turned back to the room. He picked up his drink. He watched the room. Kellner stood there for a moment. Then he turned and walked back through the crowd toward the bar. The three people he had left there were looking at him with the careful expressions of people who have been watching from a distance and have understood what they watched. He picked up a fresh drink from the bar. He did not go back to Eastwood. He did not speak to Eastwood again that evening. The 8 seconds have never been precisely recorded. The accounts of the people who were nearby vary on the count. Some say 6, some say 9. The woman who had been in Kellner's group at the bar said 8, and she said it with the specificity of someone who had been counting, because she had been counting, because she was a writer, and writers count things. She told the story to a colleague the following week. She told it with the accuracy of a woman who had been paying close attention. She said, "I counted 8 seconds. She said, "I have never seen a man removed from a situation without being touched." She said, "Eastwood didn't raise a hand. He didn't raise his voice. He said one sentence, and he looked at him, and Kellner's hand came off in 8 seconds. And Kellner walked back to the bar and didn't finish his drink." She told this story for 20 years before it appeared in a published form, in a memoir she wrote in 1994 about her years working in the Hollywood studio system in the 70s and 80s. The memoir was well reviewed and not widely read. The passage about the lobby of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion was 3 paragraphs. Those 3 paragraphs have circulated independently of the rest of the book for 30 years, because they are the kind of 3 paragraphs that people copy out and send to each other and find again years later and read again. She did not name Kellner in the memoir. She had no particular reason to protect him. She said in an interview at the time that she simply felt the story was not about him. The story was about the man who stayed still. Clint Eastwood went into the main hall that evening and sat through the ceremony. He did not win anything. He had not been nominated for anything. He was there because the industry expected its people to be present, and he was present. He watched the ceremony with the same quality of attention he had given the lobby, which was complete and gave nothing away. When it was over, he went to the governor's ball and ate dinner and talked to the people next to him and left at a reasonable hour. He did not mention the lobby to anyone that evening. He did not mention it to anyone afterward. The woman writer mentioned it. The 2 people nearest them mentioned it to each other. A lighting technician named Bob Ferris, who had been setting up cable runs for the broadcast near the far wall, saw enough to understand the shape of what happened and mentioned it to his crew chief the following morning. Bob Ferris gave a single interview about it in 2001 when a documentary was being made about the Hollywood of the 70s. He said, "I was about 30 feet away laying cable. I saw the producer walk over and I saw him put his hand on Eastwood's arm, and I saw what happened next." The documentary interviewer asked what happened next. Ferris said, "Nothing happened next. That's the point. Nothing happened and everything happened." The producer walked away. Eastwood turned back to the room. "I've been in this business 40 years, and I have seen men put their hands on other men, and I have seen what comes of it. And that night was the quietest and the most complete version of it I have ever seen." The producer walked away on his own legs. That was new for me. Richard Kellner produced 4 more pictures after 1973. None of them were as commercially successful as his earlier work. He retired from active production in 1981. He moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. He wrote a memoir of his own in 1986 that was published by a small press in Los Angeles. In it, he discussed his career in terms that were broadly flattering to himself and that did not mention the lobby of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in March of 1973. He did not mention Clint Eastwood in the memoir at all. Not once. In a career of 11 produced pictures that included 3 which starred or were directed by Eastwood-adjacent talent, the omission is notable. Kellner died in 1997. He was 78 years old. The Scottsdale newspaper ran a brief notice. The trades ran nothing. The memoir is out of print. There are 4 copies in the Los Angeles Public Library system. 2 of them have been checked out in the last decade. The other 2 have not been checked out since 1991. Eastwood went on to direct and produce a body of work that the industry spent the 1970s treating as commercial product, and the 1980s and 1990s reassessing as something more complicated. Unforgiven won him 2 Academy Awards in 1993 for Best Picture and Best Director. He stood on the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion that night and held the award and gave a brief speech that was characteristically short and did not contain the word "I" more than twice. He had been in that building 20 years earlier in a lobby where a man had put his hand on his arm and been asked once to take it off. He did not mention this in his acceptance speech. There would have been no reason to mention it. The moment had been complete in the lobby. It did not need to be completed again from a stage. Some men accumulate 20 years and arrive at an award and use the platform to settle accounts they are still carrying. Eastwood did not carry that kind of account. He had settled it in 8 seconds in a lobby in 1973. The account was closed. He went home. He put the award somewhere in his house in Carmel. He went to work the next day. There are men who believe that power is demonstrated by the volume of its expression. There are men who believe that power is demonstrated by the speed of its expression. And then there are men who understand that power is most completely demonstrated by its stillness, by the knowledge that you do not have to raise your voice or your hand or your volume, that you can say what needs to be said in the same tone you have been using, and that the other person will understand, and that their hand will come off your arm, and that they will walk back to the bar on their own legs without anyone having to help them. 8 seconds, 1 sentence, the same voice. That is everything. That is the whole distance between a man who needs to be seen acting and a man who acts and returns to watching the room. Clint Eastwood returned to watching the room. That is the story. That is the whole of it. And unfortunately, they do not make men like that anymore. If this story reached you, pass it on. Share it with someone who understands the difference between a loud man and a still one. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them deserves to be told.